Plantation records from the Louisiana sugar country contain an entry that medical experts still find impossible to explain. A woman in bondage gave birth to 3 living children in a single night. Something so rare that most doctors of the era had never witnessed it. But the birth itself wasn't what made this case extraordinary. What happened 72 hours later would be documented in letters witnessed by multiple people and whispered about in both slave quarters and plantation houses for decades. The decision made that week violated every maternal instinct, defied the natural order, and left a question that still haunts anyone who examines the evidence. When survival requires the unthinkable, can we truly judge the choice? Before we continue with the story of what happened at Belle Riviere Plantation in the spring of 1847, I need you to do something. Hit that subscribe button, because stories like this, real, documented cases that history tried to bury, don't just disappear on their own. And leave a comment telling me what state or city you're listening from. I want to know where in America people still care about these hidden truths. What happened next would force everyone involved to confront a question no one should ever have to answer. Belle Riviere Plantation sat along a bend in Bayou La Fourche, 30 miles south of Donaldsville, where the water moved slow and dark through fields that stretched toward the Gulf. The main house rose 3 stories, white columns holding up galleries where the Arsenault family took their evening air when the heat became unbearable. Behind it, the sugar mill's brick chimney stood like a finger pointing at God. And beyond that, 2 rows of cabins housed the 87 people who made the Arsenault fortune possible. In April of 1847, Louisiana sugar was worth more than cotton. And planters like Etienne Arsenault understood that enslaved people represented not just labor, but investment. A healthy woman of childbearing age could be valued at $1,200. Her children would add to that value from the moment they drew breath. Arsenault kept meticulous records, births, deaths, illnesses, sales, purchases, in leather-bound ledgers that his wife Marie-Thérèse occasionally reviewed when managing the household accounts. Among those 87 souls was a woman the records listed simply as Delphine, aged 24, house servant, light complexion, valued at $1,400. The extra $200 in her valuation came from her appearance and her position. She worked in the main house, serving meals, cleaning chambers, and assisting Madame Arsenault with her toilette. This proximity to the family meant better food, lighter work than the fields, and a small cabin she shared with only one other woman instead of a family of 6. It also meant visibility. Everything Delphine did happened under someone's watch. Her pregnancy became apparent in December of 1846, and the records noted clinically, Delphine with child, due approximately April. The father wasn't listed, but anyone who'd been at Belle Riviere for more than a season understood the mathematics of a house servant's pregnancy. Some things didn't require documentation. Delphine continued her work through the winter months, her belly swelling beneath the simple dresses the house servants wore. Marie-Thérèse Arsenault, a devout Catholic who attended Mass every Sunday at St. Philomena's Church in Donaldsville, took particular interest in the pregnancy. She'd lost 2 children to fever in their infancy and had no living sons to inherit Belle Riviere. When she looked at Delphine's expanding form, she saw potential. Another child born on the plantation, another piece of property, another investment in the future. "You're carrying large," she told Delphine one morning in March, her hand resting briefly on the swell. "Perhaps twins. Dr. Broussard should examine you before your time comes." Dr. Louis Broussard made the journey from Donaldsville twice monthly to tend to the Arsenault family, and occasionally to enslaved people whose value justified the expense. He arrived on April 3rd, his medical bag worn smooth from years of house calls throughout Ascension Parish. The examination took place in Delphine's cabin. Dr. Broussard pressed his hands against her abdomen, his brow furrowing as he felt the movements within. He listened with his wooden stethoscope, counting heartbeats. When he emerged, he found Madame Arsenault waiting on the cabin's narrow porch. "Well?" she asked. "3," he said simply. 3 distinct heartbeats. I've only seen this twice before in my career, and neither pregnancy ended with living children. The chances of all 3 surviving the birth are extraordinarily slim, madame. I must be frank, the chances of even one surviving are poor, and the mother herself faces considerable danger. Marie-Thérèse's expression shifted through calculation, visible to anyone watching. If they live, they would be mulatto children. Light, like their mother. Almost certainly given Delphine's complexion. Such children have value, Dr. Broussard. If they survive, madam, I urge you to prepare for disappointment. But preparation took many forms at Belle Riviere. That evening, Etienne Arsenault made an entry in his ledger. April 3rd, 1847, Delphine expected to deliver 3 children, possibly viable if light. Assess and decide allocation per market value. The words, assess and decide allocation, would later become the center of everything that followed. O evento sombrio. April 14th arrived with unseasonable warmth. The air hung thick with moisture from the bayou, and by late afternoon, thunderclouds built to the south, turning the sky the color of a bruise. Delphine's labor began just after the supper dishes were cleared from the main house. The other women brought her to her cabin. They sent word to the main house, and Dr. Broussard was summoned from Donaldsville, though everyone knew he wouldn't arrive in time. A woman named Ruth, who'd delivered dozens of babies in the quarters over her 48 years, took charge of the situation. What happened over the next 7 hours would be documented in fragments. Ruth's testimony given later, notes from Dr. Broussard when he finally arrived, and a letter from Marie-Thérèse to her sister in New Orleans, written a week after the birth. The labor was difficult. Ruth later told the other women that she'd never seen anything like it. 3 children trying to enter the world at once, each one fighting against the others. The first baby arrived just after midnight. A girl, small but breathing, her skin the color of fresh cream with the faintest amber undertone. Ruth wrapped her in a piece of clean cotton and laid her in a basket near the fire to keep warm. The second came 20 minutes later. Another girl, smaller than the first, darker in complexion with thick black hair already visible. She came out silent, and Ruth had to work to get her breathing, turning her upside down and rubbing her back until finally a thin wail emerged. The third took another hour. By the time this baby, a boy, finally arrived, Delphine had lost consciousness from exhaustion. The boy was the darkest of the 3, his skin holding tones of deeper bronze. He was also the smallest, barely 5 pounds, Ruth estimated, and his cry was weaker than his sister's. When Dr. Broussard arrived at dawn, he found 3 living babies and a mother who was alive but depleted in ways that concerned him. He examined each infant carefully, noting their sizes, their breathing, their color, their vigor. He wrote his observations in a small notebook he kept for medical records. Remarkable, he murmured to Ruth. All 3 alive. I didn't think it possible. God makes possible what he wants, Ruth said quietly. But it wasn't God's will that would determine what happened next. It was arithmetic. Etienne Arsenault arrived at the cabin mid-morning with his wife. They stood in the doorway, looking at the 3 baskets arranged near the fire, each containing a tiny human being that represented both miracle and commodity. Marie-Thérèse moved from basket to basket, studying each child with the same attention she gave to evaluating fabric at the dry goods store in Donaldsville. She lifted each baby briefly, examining skin tone in the morning light streaming through the cabin's single window. The first girl, she said finally. She's the lightest. She could pass for white in certain company. That makes her valuable, Etienne agreed. Very valuable, especially as she grows. She could be trained for house service, perhaps even ladies' maid work, premium positioning. And the others? Etienne's expression remained neutral, but his words carried weight. Darker children are more difficult to place in domestic service. Field work is their future, which means their value caps lower. And 3 infants represent 3 times the resources: milk, care, time away from work for the mother. The return on investment must be calculated carefully. Dr. Broussard cleared his throat. Monsieur Arsenault, These are newborns. They require their mother. All three? Etienne's question hung in the air. Dr. Broussard, you yourself said multiple births rarely produce three viable children. Nature has a way of selecting the strongest. Perhaps we should allow nature to continue that selection. Marie-Thérèse touched her husband's arm gently. Etienne, we cannot simply... We are Catholic people. Father Duchamp deals in souls, my dear. I deal in property. These are separate matters. He turned to Dr. Broussard. How many children can a woman in Delphine's condition reasonably nurse and keep alive? The doctor's discomfort was visible. 1, perhaps 2 if she's strong and well fed. 3 would be unlikely to all survive even under the best circumstances. The smallest one, the boy, is particularly fragile. Then medical reality supports a practical decision. Etienne looked down at Delphine, who was beginning to stir back to consciousness. She can keep the lightest child, the one with the best future. The other 2 must go elsewhere. Elsewhere? Marie-Thérèse's voice dropped to a whisper. I know a man in Napoleonville. He deals in difficult situations, unmarketable property, children too young for the regular markets. He'll take them, no questions asked, for a small fee. They'll be placed somewhere, perhaps with families that need extra hands as they grow, or perhaps not. That's not our concern. Dr. Broussard stepped forward. Monsieur, I must protest. Your protest is noted and dismissed. You've delivered the children. Your work here is complete. Etienne's voice carried the finality of a man who'd made countless such decisions before. Delphine will be informed when she wakes. She has until Sunday morning, 3 days, to say goodbye to the 2 who will leave. I am not without mercy. I'm giving her time to accept the reality. He turned to leave, then paused at the door. The lightest one stays. That's the decision. Document it in your records, Doctor. Note that we kept the most viable child. That's the truth of the matter, after all. When Delphine fully regained consciousness an hour later, Ruth had to be the one to tell her. The sound that came from Delphine's throat wasn't a scream or a sob. It was something more fundamental, more ancient. The sound of a mother understanding that her children would be torn apart, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The 3 days that followed the birth became a study in impossible mathematics. How do you divide a mother's love into 3 parts when you know 2 parts will be taken? How do you say goodbye to children who haven't yet opened their eyes fully, who don't yet know their own hands from the world around them? Delphine spent those 72 hours in her cabin, dismissed from her duties in the main house. The other women from the quarters came when they could, bringing food she didn't eat, offering comfort that couldn't penetrate the wall of her grief. They brought cloth to make simple gowns for the babies. They boiled water for washing. They did the small, practical things that life requires, even when life has become unbearable. Ruth stayed almost constantly. She'd seen children sold away from mothers before. It was one of the permanent horrors that hung over every enslaved mother's existence. But she'd never seen it happen at 3 days old. She'd never seen it happen to triplets. She'd never seen a mother forced to choose by proximity and care which child would live a life she could witness. You got to feed all 3 while you can, Ruth told Delphine on the 2nd day. Your milk is coming in strong. Don't let them go hungry just because they're leaving. But that was the cruelty of it. Delphine had to care for all 3 equally while knowing the care was temporary for 2. She had to memorize faces that hadn't yet fully formed their features. She had to count fingers and toes that might walk roads she'd never see. She had to breathe in their scent, that particular sweetness of new skin, and know it would fade from memory without constant reinforcement. The lightest child, the one who would stay, seemed to sense nothing wrong. She nursed vigorously, her tiny fists clenching and unclenching against Delphine's skin. The second daughter, darker than her sister, was fussier, struggling to latch properly, as if already protesting the future being written for her. The boy remained the smallest, the quietest, sleeping most of those 3 days as if he'd already given up the fight. On Friday evening, Marie-Thérèse Arsenault came to the cabin. She brought a dress she no longer wore, good cotton with only a few moth holes near the hem. "For the baby's christening gown," she said, her voice carrying a forced brightness. "The one who's staying should be baptized properly. Father Duchamp can come next week." Delphine looked up from where she sat with all 3 babies arranged around her. "And the others, madame? Do they not deserve baptism?" Marie-Thérèse's face tightened. "That's not my decision, Delphine. My husband has made arrangements. I tried to persuade him differently, but he..." She stopped, perhaps realizing that sharing her marital disagreements with an enslaved woman was inappropriate. "The dress is for the child who stays, that's all." After she left, Ruth took the dress and examined it. "She fought for you in her way," Ruth said quietly. "Madame sometimes has kindness in her, but kindness don't change property law. Kindness don't change what men decide." Saturday brought rain, heavy and relentless, turning the paths between the cabins into rivers of red mud. Delphine watched the water run past her doorway and thought about the bayou that bordered the plantation, about how easy it would be to walk into that dark water with all 3 children and simply not come back out. The thought came to her clearly, without drama, a simple equation. If all 3 would die, at least they would die together with her, knowing nothing but her arms around them. Ruth saw the direction of her gaze. "Don't," she said sharply. "Don't you dare think it. You got 1 baby who needs you to live. 1 out of 3 is better than none out of 3. You hear me? Is it?" Delphine's voice was hollow. "Is it better? They'll grow up wondering if they had a mother. They'll grow up wondering why they weren't wanted. They were wanted. They are wanted. But wanting don't matter when you're property. You know that. I know you know that. Which one do I give more to tonight, Ruth? Which one do I hold longer? How do I choose that? You don't choose. You hold them all the same. You love them all the same. And you remember that the 2 who leave still got the first 3 days with their mama. Some children born into slavery don't get 3 minutes. You gave them 3 days. That's something. But 3 days against a lifetime felt like nothing at all. Sunday morning arrived with clearing skies and a knock at the cabin door at dawn. Etienne Arsenault didn't enter himself. He sent the overseer, a man named Thibodeau, who handled the unpleasant aspects of plantation management. Thibodeau had brought a wagon and another man, someone Delphine didn't recognize, someone whose face she would spend the rest of her life trying to forget. "Time," Thibodeau said. He had the decency not to meet her eyes. Delphine had dressed the 2 departing children in the simple gowns the women had made. She'd fed them one last time. She'd sung to them, a song her own mother had sung to her before she'd been sold away at age 12, a song in a language she didn't remember learning but knew in her bones. The stranger stepped forward and held out his arms for the first baby. "Names?" he asked. "They don't have names yet," Thibodeau said. "Just take them." "Wait." Delphine's voice stopped everyone. She looked down at the darker daughter, the one who'd been fussy, the one who'd fought. "Her name is Beatrice. The boy is called Christophe." The stranger nodded and took Beatrice first. She started crying immediately, a thin wail that cut through the morning air. Then he took Christophe, who remained silent, his eyes closed, his small chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. Delphine held the remaining child against her chest so tightly that Ruth had to touch her arm gently. "Careful, baby. You'll hurt her." The wagon pulled away with Thibodeau driving and the stranger sitting in back, a baby in each arm, wrapped in the gowns that would probably be taken from them and sold separately before noon. Delphine stood in the cabin doorway, her remaining daughter in her arms, and watched until the wagon disappeared beyond the sugar mill, heading north toward Napoleonville. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just stood there, memorizing the empty space where her children had been. Ruth finally led her back inside. "What are you going to name this one?" she asked, trying to redirect Delphine's attention to the living child she still held. Delphine looked down at the lightest baby, The one chosen for survival because her skin color promised better market value, because her potential as a house servant outweighed her siblings' futures in the fields. This child, who'd been selected by nothing more than the accident of her complexion, the luck of genetics that put slightly less melanin in her skin. Clementine, Delphine said finally. Her name is Clementine. That's a beautiful name. It means mercy. Delphine's voice was flat. It's a lie, but it's her name. The weeks that followed the separation created a routine built on absence. Delphine returned to work in the main house after 2 weeks. Clementine strapped to her back in a sling while she performed her duties. Marie-Thérèse permitted this arrangement because it kept the child visible, kept her growing accustomed to the rhythms of the household where she would one day serve. But something in Delphine had calcified. The other house servants noticed it. The way she moved through her work with mechanical efficiency, but no warmth, no small conversations, no songs hummed while polishing silver or sweeping floors. She fed Clementine, changed her, kept her clean and healthy. But there was a quality of going through motions, of performing motherhood rather than inhabiting it. She don't talk to that baby the way a mother should, one of the other women said to Ruth in May, when Clementine was 6 weeks old. She takes care of her needs, but she don't seem to love her. Ruth understood. Part of her went away in that wagon. When you lose 2 children, the third one is a reminder of what's gone. Every time she looks at Clementine, she sees Beatrice and Christophe. That's a hard weight for any woman to carry. But there was more to it than grief. There was a question that Delphine turned over in her mind during the long hours of housework. A question that had no answer but demanded asking anyway. What had happened to them? The stranger who'd taken them hadn't given a name. Thibodeau claimed not to know where they'd gone. Napoleonville could mean anywhere in a 20-mile radius. Could mean they'd been passed to someone else who took them further. Could mean they'd been sold to a family that wouldn't keep them together. Could mean they'd died within days and been buried in unmarked graves. Not knowing was its own form of torture. In June, Delphine did something that could have gotten her severely punished. She asked Etienne Arsenault directly what had become of her other children. He looked up from the ledger where he was recording sugar production figures. They were placed appropriately for their value. That's all you need to know. Are they alive? That's not your concern, Delphine. You have a healthy daughter to raise. Focus on her. Focus on your work. These questions are inappropriate. I'm their mother. You are property asking about property. The discussion is over. But the discussion wasn't over in Delphine's mind. She began to notice things. The way Marie-Thérèse avoided looking at Clementine directly. The way Dr. Broussard, on his monthly visits, would ask about the baby's health, but never mentioned the other 2. The way the whole household moved around the subject, like mourners avoiding a fresh grave. In July, something changed. A woman arrived at Belle Rivière from a neighboring plantation, delivering preserves that Madame Arsenault had requested. Her name was Thérèse, and she worked in the kitchen of the Boudreau plantation 15 miles upriver. During her brief visit, while waiting for Madame Arsenault to inspect the preserves and provide payment, she stood in the main house kitchen with Delphine and the other servants. Her eyes fell on Clementine, now 3 months old and growing into her features. "That's a light baby you got there," Thérèse said. "She the only one?" Something in her tone made Delphine look up sharply. "Why do you ask?" Thérèse glanced toward the door to make sure they were alone. "Because there's talk. Along the bayou, people talk. About a man from Napoleonville who had twin babies for sale back in April. Dark infants. Said they came from Belle Rivière. Said they were born 3 at once, and the lightest one was kept." Delphine's heart stopped. Twins? There were 3. He only had 2, according to what I heard. A girl and a boy. Somebody bought them together, which is unusual. Usually they separate siblings young because it's more profit that way. But these went together to a family up north of Thibodeau. What family? I don't know the name, but I know someone who might. If you ever get to Napoleonville, there's a free woman of color named Josephine LeBlanc who runs a boarding house. She knows everyone, hears everything. If anyone knows where those babies went, it's her. Before Delphine could ask more questions, Marie-Thérèse entered the kitchen, and the conversation ended. But the information burned in Delphine's mind like a coal that wouldn't extinguish. 2 babies sold together, to a family north of Thibodeau. Beatrice and Christophe might be alive, might be together, might be only 25 miles away, a distance that might as well have been the moon for an enslaved woman with no freedom of movement. That night, Delphine lay in her cabin with Clémentine sleeping beside her. She looked at her daughter's face in the dim firelight and felt the full weight of the impossible situation. If she tried to find her other children, she would be caught and punished, possibly sold herself, which would separate Clémentine from her mother the same way Beatrice and Christophe had been separated. If she did nothing, she would spend the rest of her life wondering if they were alive, if they remembered her smell, her voice, the 3 days they'd spent in her arms. She made a decision that night. It would take time. It would require careful planning. But she would find out what had happened to her children, even if it took years, even if it cost her everything. What she didn't know was that finding the answer would reveal a truth more disturbing than anything she'd imagined. Autumn came to Belle Riviere with its brief relief from heat, the weeks when Louisiana remembered it wasn't entirely a furnace. Clémentine grew stronger, her features developing the delicate beauty that Marie-Thérèse had predicted. By October, she was 6 months old, sitting up on her own, reaching for objects with focused determination. The women in the quarters agreed she was going to be beautiful, and in the calculus of slavery, beauty meant value, and value meant attention. Not all of it welcome. Delphine began to learn the roots. Every plantation existed within a network: supply deliveries, produce sales, church gatherings, doctors' visits, social calls between plantation families. These movements created opportunities, tiny windows when information could travel, when quiet questions could be asked, when an enslaved person might learn something the owners didn't want known. She learned that Thibodeau made a monthly trip to Napoleonville for supplies. She learned that sometimes he took one of the enslaved men to help load the wagon. She learned that if someone could get into that wagon, someone might be able to speak to Josephine Leblanc, the free woman of color who knew everything that happened in Napoleonville. In November, opportunity arrived in an unexpected form. Dr. Broussard needed an assistant for a difficult delivery on a plantation near Napoleonville. The enslaved midwife there had died, and the situation was urgent. Marie-Thérèse suggested Delphine. She'd learned enough from Ruth, and she'd successfully recovered from her own difficult delivery. It would be good training for her, Marie-Thérèse told her husband. House servants with medical skills are more valuable, and Dr. Broussard can supervise her. Thibodeau can drive them. Etienne agreed. The trip was arranged for November 18th. Delphine had 5 days to plan what she would do with the precious hours in Napoleonville. She couldn't be obvious. She couldn't put herself at risk in a way that would end her search before it began. But she might be able to slip away for a few minutes, might be able to ask the right questions, might be able to learn something, anything, about where Beatrice and Christophe had gone. The delivery they attended was long and difficult. A woman named Margot labored for 14 hours before finally producing a stillborn son. Dr. Broussard did what he could, but by the time they finished, night had fallen, and Thibodeau declared they would stay in Napoleonville overnight, rather than risk the roads in darkness. They took rooms at a small inn near the church. Delphine was given a pallet in the kitchen, the standard accommodation for enslaved people traveling with their owners. But the kitchen backed onto an alley, and the back door had only a simple latch. She waited until she was sure Thibodeau and Dr. Broussard were asleep in their rooms upstairs. Then she slipped out into the November night. Napoleonville wasn't large, and Josephine Leblanc's boarding house was known locally. A free black man sitting on a porch directed Delphine to a 2-story house 3 streets over, painted yellow with green shutters, a lamp burning in the front window despite the late hour. Delphine knocked quietly. After a moment, a woman opened the door, tall, elegant, her hair wrapped in a silk tignon, her dress marking her as someone of means. This was Josephine LeBlanc. "I don't have rooms available," Josephine began, but Delphine interrupted. "I'm not looking for a room. I'm looking for information about 2 babies sold here in April. A girl and a boy, dark complexion, born at Belle Riviere Plantation. I'm their mother." Josephine's expression shifted from business to something more complex, recognition perhaps, or sympathy. She stepped aside. "Come in, quickly." The parlor was furnished well with chairs that matched and curtains that didn't have patches. Josephine gestured for Delphine to sit, then took a chair opposite. "I remember," Josephine said. "Everyone in Napoleonville remembers. It was unusual. Triplets, and the lightest one kept. The man who brought the other 2 was named Mathieu Gaspard. He deals in problematic property. Infants too young for field work, children with defects, elderly slaves no longer profitable. He finds solutions." "Where did they go?" "To a family named Heber, up near Thibodeau. They own a small farm, grow tobacco mostly. They needed children who could work in a few years, and they were willing to take both babies together because it was cheaper than buying one older child. $30 for the pair." "That's what I heard. $30. Her children had been sold for less than the cost of a decent horse." "Are they alive?" Josephine hesitated. "I don't know. That was 7 months ago. Infant mortality is high, especially for babies that young separated from their mother. But the Hebers are Catholic. They attend St. Joseph's Church. They're not known for cruelty, at least not by local standards. If the babies survived, they would be with the Hebers still." "Where exactly?" "I can't tell you that, eh? If I give you directions and you run and you're caught, they'll come back to me asking who helped you. I can't risk that. I'm not running. I just need to know they're alive." "Why? What good does knowing do you? You can't get them back, you know that." "Because I need to know if I abandoned living children or dead ones. I need to know if they're breathing somewhere, if they're growing, if they remember anything about the 3 days before they were taken. I need to know something, Madame LeBlanc. I need to know anything at all." Josephine stood and walked to a small desk near the window. She took out paper and a pencil, wrote something down, then folded the paper carefully. "This is a map. It shows you how to get to the Heber farm from Thibodeau. If you're ever in Thibodeau, if you ever have an hour free, you could walk to this place. You could see the farm. You could know." She handed the folded paper to Delphine. "But I never gave this to you. If anyone asks, you never came here. Do you understand?" "I understand. And Delphine, if you find them alive, don't try to take them. They'll hunt you down, and they'll kill you, and your children will end up scattered to 3 different plantations, none with their mother. Sometimes knowing is all we get. It's not enough, but it's all there is." Delphine left the boarding house with the folded map hidden in her dress. She made it back to the inn before dawn, slipped back onto her pallet in the kitchen, and lay there watching the ceiling lighten with morning, her heart pounding with the weight of what she now knew. Beatrice and Christophe might be alive. They were 25 miles away. The distance was impossible and might as well have been nothing at all. The opportunity to get to Thibodeau came in March of 1848, a full 11 months after the triplets' birth. Marie-Thérèse's sister, Adélaïde, had fallen ill, and the family was summoned to her house in Thibodeau to help during her convalescence. Marie-Thérèse would need assistance, and she chose Delphine to accompany her, partially for Delphine's skills as a house servant, partially because Clémentine, now nearly 1 year old, had become Marie-Thérèse's favorite child on the plantation. The madame liked having the beautiful light-skinned baby nearby. They traveled by carriage, arriving at Adélaïde's house on a Tuesday afternoon. The journey took most of the day, following the roads that paralleled the bayous connecting the sugar parishes. Delphine sat in the back of the carriage with Clémentine on her lap, watching the landscape change from Belle Riviere's familiar territory to new ground. Every mile closer to Thibodeau tightened the knot in her chest. The folded map remained hidden in the small cloth bag she carried, touched so many times over the past months that the creases had begun to wear thin. Adélaïde's house sat in town, surrounded by neighbors and commerce. very different from the isolation of Belle Riviere. It was a modest two-story structure with a gallery that wrapped around the second floor, close enough to the church that the bells could be heard clearly throughout the day. The proximity to town life meant more movement, more people, more potential for the kind of brief invisibility Delphine would need. Her duties would keep her busy. Adelaide's illness, a persistent fever that left her weak and bedridden, required constant attention. Delphine would prepare meals, change linens, assist with bathing, and manage the small household tasks that Adelaide's regular servant couldn't handle alone. Marie-Thérèse would supervise, as she always did, but the work itself fell to Delphine's hands. She had to be careful. She had to be invisible, but she had to try. The first 2 days passed in a blur of activity. Delphine learned the rhythms of Adelaide's household, the routines that would govern her time. She noted when Marie-Thérèse took her afternoon rest, when the other servants were occupied with their own tasks, when the streets outside were busiest, and a black woman walking with purpose might blend into the normal flow of town life. On the third day of their stay, Marie-Thérèse sent Delphine to the apothecary with a list of medicines needed for Adelaide. The errand would take an hour, perhaps 2 if the apothecary was busy preparing tinctures. It was the opening Delphine had been waiting for, the window of time that might never come again. She took Clémentine strapped to her back as she always did, and left the house with the list and a small purse of coins Marie-Thérèse had provided for the purchases. The apothecary shop sat on the main street, its windows displaying colored glass bottles that caught the afternoon light. Delphine entered and placed the order with the proprietor, a thin white man who barely looked at her as he reviewed the list. "This will take some time," he said. "The laudanum needs to be measured carefully, and I'm out of the camphor tincture. I'll need to prepare it fresh. Come back in 2 hours." 2 hours. It was more time than she'd hoped for, more than she'd dared to expect. She nodded and left the shop, her heart already racing with the weight of what she was about to do. The map led her out of Thibodeau proper, along a road that paralleled a small creek. The afternoon was warm, unseasonably so for March, and Clémentine grew heavy on her back as Delphine walked. She passed several farms, their fields already showing the early green of spring planting. A few people, both enslaved workers and white overseers, looked at her as she passed, but no one stopped. Those 3 babies had never been born together, as if the decision to separate them had been natural rather than the calculated application of property values to human flesh. Delphine made a decision that night that would shape everything that followed. She would tell Clémentine the truth when the child was old enough to understand. She would make sure that the names Béatrice and Christophe were spoken aloud, were remembered, were kept alive in the world, even if the people bearing those names never knew they'd been given them. It wasn't justice. It wasn't reunion. It wasn't the ending that any mother would choose. But it was the only form of resistance available to her, the refusal to let her children's existence be erased by the system that had scattered them. Delphine returned to Belle Riviere with Clémentine and Marie-Thérèse 4 days later, and life continued in the way that life continues in places where human beings are property. The seasons turned with their predictable rhythms. The sugarcane grew tall and green through the summer, was cut in the fall, processed in the winter. The Arsenault family prospered, their ledgers showing steady profits from the labor of the people they owned. Children were born in the quarters, and some died and others were sold away to plantations further west or south. The Mississippi River flooded its banks in the spring of 1849, and Belle Riviere lost a portion of its lowest fields to the water's temporary reclamation. Through all of this, Delphine performed her duties with the same mechanical efficiency that had characterized her work since the separation. She served meals in the main house, cleaned chambers, assisted Marie-Thérèse with her toilette and correspondence. She raised Clémentine with careful attention, teaching her the skills that would make her valuable, the behaviors that would keep her safe, the invisible knowledge that every enslaved person had to master, how to read white moods, how to become invisible when necessary, how to survive. But something fundamental had shifted after the trip to Thibodeau. Knowing her other children lived changed the mathematics of her grief. It wasn't better or worse, it was different, more complex, layered with the strange comfort of confirmed existence alongside the pain of permanent separation. She could picture them now, not as abstractions or frozen memories of 3-day-old infants, but as real children walking and talking somewhere she could find on a map. That knowledge was both balm and poison, soothing and burning in equal measure. The years accumulated slowly. Clémentine grew into a beautiful child, exactly as Marie-Thérèse had predicted. By age 3, she was helping with small tasks in the main house, fetching items, carrying messages between rooms, entertaining Marie-Thérèse with her quick mimicry of adult behaviors. By age 5, Marie-Thérèse had begun teaching her to read, an unusual choice that sparked some comment among the Arsenault family's social circle, but was defended on practical grounds. A literate house servant could read recipes, take dictation, manage household accounts, skills that significantly increased her value and future earning potential if hired out to wealthy families. Delphine observed this education with mixed feelings. Literacy was power, even constrained literacy. It was also visibility, which brought its own dangers, but she encouraged Clémentine's learning, adding her own lessons in the evenings when they were alone in their cabin. She taught Clémentine carefully, deliberately, with a purpose the child was too young to fully understand. She taught her to be observant, to notice details that others missed, who was angry and hiding it, who was lying and covering it, who could be trusted and who should be avoided. She taught her to remember things precisely, to hold stories in her mind with all their details intact. She taught her that having a light complexion was both an advantage and a burden, that it would open certain doors while closing others, that it would make some people favor her and make others resent her, and that neither reaction had anything to do with who she actually was. And when Clémentine turned 6 years old enough to understand permanence, old enough to grasp that the world contained both seen and unseen realities, Delphine told her about Béatrice and Christophe. They were sitting together in the cabin one evening in early April of 1853, 6 years almost to the day after the triplets' birth. The spring air carried the heavy sweetness of flowering plants from the main house gardens. Clémentine was practicing her letters on a slate, forming the alphabet with careful concentration. "You have a sister and a brother," Delphine said quietly, breaking the comfortable silence. "They were born the same night as you. They look different from you. Darker skin, different features. But they're your blood, your family. They live on a farm near Thibodeau with people named Hébert." Clémentine's hand stopped mid-letter. She looked up, her light brown eyes wide with confusion. "Why don't they live here?" "Because the people who own us decided you were more valuable. Your skin is lighter, and light skin means more money when you're property. So they kept you and sent Béatrice and Christophe away 3 days after you were all born. But I need you to know they exist. I need you to know their names. I need you to remember that you came into this world with 2 other people, and part of you is always going to be incomplete without them. Can we go see them?" The question pierced Delphine's heart with its innocent impossibility. "No, baby, we can't. Enslaved people can't just travel where we want. But I have seen them. When you were 1 year old, I walked to that farm and I saw them playing in a yard. They were alive and together. I watched them for as long as I could, and I memorized everything so I could tell you someday." Clémentine was silent for a long moment, processing information that reshaped her understanding of herself. "Do they know about me?" "No. They don't know they have a sister. They probably don't even know they were born as triplets. The Héberts might have told them they came from Belle Rivière, but that's all. They don't know the truth of what happened, and they might never know unless someone tells them. Will you tell them?" "I can't. I'll probably never see them again. But I'm telling you, and you're going to remember. When you're older, if you're ever free, if you ever have the chance, you find them. You tell them they had a mother who loved them. You tell them they have a sister who knows they exist. You tell them that for 3 days they were held and fed and sung to, and they weren't abandoned because they weren't wanted. They were taken because of the color of their skin, and that's different. That matters. Do you understand? Clementine nodded slowly. At 6, she couldn't fully grasp the full horror of that mathematics, the way human beings could be evaluated and divided based on complexion. But she absorbed the essential truth. She had siblings, they were alive somewhere, and remembering them was important. She would carry that knowledge forward, would let it shape her understanding of family and loss and the arbitrary cruelties that defined enslaved people's lives. That conversation became a regular ritual between them. Every few months, Delphine would add details. Descriptions of the Hébert farm, the split oak tree, the way Beatrice had laughed while waving a stick, the way Christophe had pulled himself up using his sister's dress. She repeated the names until they were etched into Clementine's memory as deeply as her own name. She made the absent siblings real through the only power available to her. Storytelling, repetition, insistence that they mattered even in their absence. The years passed with increasing weight. Delphine aged in the way that enslaved people aged, faster than free people, worn down by labor and grief compounded year after year. She developed a cough in her 30s that never fully went away, a persistent rattle in her chest that worsened in the damp winters. By 40, she moved slowly, her joints stiff from years of work that required constant standing, constant bending, constant physical strain. By 45, she was no longer considered valuable enough for house service and was reassigned to lighter work in the kitchen gardens, growing vegetables for the main house and the quarters. This demotion, which would have devastated her earlier in life, brought unexpected relief. Garden work meant less visibility, less constant supervision, more hours where she could simply exist without performing. She planted tomatoes and beans and okra. She weeded and watered and harvested. Her hands, which had served elegant meals and folded delicate linens, now worked directly in soil. And there was something honest about it that house service had never provided. Clementine, meanwhile, became exactly what the Arsenault family had envisioned, a skilled, literate house servant whose light complexion and refined manners made her suitable for hiring out to wealthy families in New Orleans during the social season. She was 16 when she made that first journey, accompanying Marie-Thérèse to serve as a lady's maid in a Garden District mansion for 3 months during the winter of 1863. The timing was significant. The Civil War raged around them, though Louisiana's surrender wouldn't come until 1865. New Orleans had already fallen to Union forces in April of 1862, but the sugar parishes remained largely under Confederate control. The wealthy families of New Orleans continued their social season despite the war, clinging to the rituals of antebellum life even as everything around them changed. It was during that first New Orleans season that Clementine met Auguste Rousseau, a free man of color who worked as a carpenter, doing repairs and custom work for the wealthy families that populated the Garden District. The free black community in New Orleans was substantial and complex. People of mixed race who occupied an ambiguous social position between slavery and full citizenship, who owned property, ran businesses, and navigated the narrow space the law allowed them. Auguste was 30 years old, educated, politically aware, part of the networks that would later form the basis for Reconstruction-era black political organizing. He'd been born free, the son of a white merchant and an enslaved woman who'd been freed before his birth. He'd learned carpentry from his father and had built a modest but steady business serving the wealthy families who valued skilled craftsmanship. They met when he came to repair a section of gallery railing at the mansion where Clementine was working. Their first conversations were cautious, conducted in the stolen moments when white oversight was temporarily absent. A few minutes in the courtyard while he measured wood, a brief exchange in the servants' entrance while he carried tools. But over those 3 months, something built between them. Auguste recognized in Clementine the particular intelligence that slavery tried to suppress, the awareness that looked at the world and saw beyond the immediate to larger patterns and possibilities. Clementine recognized in Auguste a vision of what freedom might actually mean. Not just absence of legal bondage, but the ability to make choices, to plan futures, to exist as a complete person rather than someone else's property. "I'm saving money," Auguste told her one evening when they had 5 precious minutes alone in the mansion's courtyard. Twilight softened the edges of the world around them, and the sounds of the White family's dinner party filtered through the windows above. "In a few years, I'll have enough to buy someone's freedom. The prices have changed with the war. Some owners are willing to sell now who wouldn't have considered it before. If you were for sale, if I could negotiate with the Arsenault family—" "I have family," Clementine interrupted. She'd been waiting for this conversation, had known it was coming since their 3rd or 4th meeting, when his interest had become clear. "My mother is still at Belle Riviere, and I have 2 siblings I've never met, a sister and a brother living on a farm near Thibodeau. If I'm ever free, I can't just save myself." She told him the story, the triplets, the separation, the 3 days before Beatrice and Christophe were taken, the walk to the Hébert farm when all 3 babies were 11 months old. Auguste listened with the expression of someone hearing a story that was simultaneously unique in its specific details and utterly common in its essential truth. Every enslaved person had a version of this story. Every family had been broken by the mathematics of property value, by the casual cruelties that reduced human relationships to economic calculations. "If I help you," Auguste said slowly, his voice careful with the weight of the promise he was considering, "if I find a way to learn about those children, to discover if they're still at that farm, if they're still alive, would you want to know, even if the answer is painful?" Yes, not knowing is worse than any truth could be. Auguste kept his promise, though it took longer than either of them anticipated. The war complicated everything: travel restrictions, documentation requirements, the general chaos of a social system collapsing. But Auguste had connections throughout southern Louisiana, networks built through years of business relationships, and the invisible community of free black people who maintained contact across parish boundaries. Over the next 2 years, he made careful inquiries. He talked to other free people of color who had connections to Thibodeau. He spoke with enslaved people who traveled with their owners, gathering fragments of information. He pieced together the story through dozens of small conversations, building a picture from scattered details. In early 1865, just months before the war's end, he came to Clementine with news. "Christophe is dead," he said quietly. "He died when he was 4. Fever took him, but Beatrice is alive. She's still at the Hébert farm. She's 21 years old, never been sold away. The Héberts aren't wealthy enough to sell property they've had since infancy. They need the labor too much." Clementine's mother was 41 by then, her cough chronic, her body worn down. When Clementine told her what Auguste had learned, Delphine wept for the first time since the separation. She wept for Christophe, who she'd carried and birthed and held for 3 days, and would never know beyond that. And she wept for Beatrice, who was alive and grown, and had lived an entire life as a stranger. "I want you to promise me something," Delphine said when the tears stopped. "When I'm gone, if you ever get free, you find her. You tell her everything. You tell her she had a brother and a mother and a sister. You tell her the truth of what happened. You don't let her spend her life thinking she was abandoned for no reason. Promise me." "I promise, Mama." Delphine died in early 1864, her lungs finally giving out after years of progressive illness. She was buried in the small cemetery behind the slave quarters at Belle Riviere, her grave marked only by a wooden cross that would rot away within a decade. The Civil War ended in 1865. The enslaved people at Belle Riviere were freed by the 13th Amendment, though freedom came with its own complications. No land, no resources, no education, no protection from the violence that erupted across the South during Reconstruction. Clementine stayed at Belle Riviere initially because she had nowhere else to go. But in 1866, she married Auguste, who had come to Louisiana specifically to find her. They moved to New Orleans, where Auguste's carpentry business provided a modest living. It took Clementine 3 more years to save enough money to make the trip to Thibodeau. She went in 1869, now 24 years old, with Auguste accompanying her for safety. They found the Hébert farm exactly where Josephine Leblanc's map had indicated all those years ago. Beatrice was still there. She was 26 years old, working as a sharecropper on the same land where she'd been enslaved as a child. The Héberts no longer owned her legally, but sharecropping contracts and debt bound her almost as effectively as slavery had. Clémentine approached her in the field where she was working, Auguste standing a respectful distance back. "Are you Beatrice?" Clémentine asked. The woman looked up, suspicion immediate in her eyes. "Who's asking?" "My name is Clémentine. I was born April 14th, 1847, at Belle Rivière Plantation in Ascension Parish. I was one of 3 children born that night. I think you were another." Beatrice straightened slowly. She was taller than Clémentine, darker-skinned, her features different but with something familiar in the shape of her eyes, the line of her jaw. "I was told I had a sister who was kept at the plantation. Lighter skin. They said that's why she stayed and we were sold. That's true. But it wasn't our mother's choice. She was forced. And she spent the rest of her life trying to find out what happened to you and your brother. Christophe had died when we were 4. I know. I'm sorry." They stood in the tobacco field looking at each other, 2 women who shared blood and birth but nothing else, not memories, not experiences, not the 1,000 small moments that make siblings into family. "Our mother's name was Delphine," Clémentine said. "She died 5 years ago. But before she died, she made me promise to find you and tell you the truth. You weren't abandoned because you weren't wanted. You were taken because of your skin color. She named you Beatrice. She named your brother Christophe. She held you for 3 days and fed you and sang to you. And she walked all the way from Thibodeau to this farm when you were 11 months old, just to see if you were alive. She stood behind that oak tree over there and watched you play in the yard with Christophe. She never forgot you, not for 1 day of her life." Beatrice's eyes filled with tears. "I don't remember her." "I know, but now you know she existed, and you know she loved you, and you know that the 3 days you had with her, she gave you everything she could." They talked for an hour, there in the field, filling in the gaps of 26 years. Beatrice had no interest in leaving the Hébert farm. It was the only home she remembered, and Madame Hébert had been kinder than many slave owners, which was a low bar, but counted for something. But she agreed to stay in touch, to write letters when she could, to maintain the connection their mother had worked so hard to preserve. Clémentine and Auguste returned to New Orleans. They had 3 children over the next decade. Clémentine named her first daughter Delphine and her first son Christophe. She told her children the story of the triplets, the separation, the mathematics of skin color that had determined their fates. She made sure they knew that family wasn't just about who you grew up with. It was about who you came from, who you remembered, who you refused to forget. The story doesn't have a happy ending because stories like this don't get happy endings. Delphine died never being reunited with 2 of her children. Christophe died at 4 years old, knowing nothing of his mother or his sisters. Beatrice spent her childhood and young adulthood believing she'd been unwanted, abandoned for being too dark. But Clémentine kept her promise. The truth was told, the names were remembered. The 3 days when they'd all been together, when Delphine had held all 3 babies and loved them equally before the world forced her to choose, became part of the family history passed down through generations. Sometimes that's all we can do. Remember and tell the truth and refuse to let the people who were erased stay erased. This mystery shows us that the cruelest choices are the ones made by systems, not individuals, and that a mother's love persists even when everything else is taken away. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. See you in the next video.